Hello, welcome. I'm Madeline Craig. I'm an educator and a life coach for families struggling with a loved one's drug or alcohol use. And this is another episode of my video blog, which I call Hope for Families TV, because I intend for all of my work to offer you hope in what I know is likely a very dark situation. So if you celebrate Thanksgiving, I'm wondering, how was it? I ask because growing up, when I was going home for holidays, even as an adult, I would never know how the holiday would go. It was always a crapshoot. And to be honest, at times it could be a ton of fun and full of laughter. And I think that's what kept me continuing to go back when I could as an adult, hoping that this one would be one of the good ones. But then there were the ones that weren't good. And when they weren't good, they were really, really bad. They were seriously a total shit show. A nightmare of drinking, arguing, insults, threats of violence. And someone always was a scapegoat or the black sheep after that. And then, of course, the gossip around everything that was wrong with that person would continue well after the holidays were over. And those horrible holidays happened frequently enough that they clearly weren't flukes. So it wasn't until I had started recovering from family addiction that I realized that there were alternatives to this drug, alcohol, and mental illness fueled shit show dynamic. But one of the first steps to that healing was actually recognizing all the ways the dysfunctional family dynamics kept me sucked into that shit show. Call this a list of what kept me doing the same thing over and over again during the holidays and expecting a different result. So here's one: believing family myths. For example, my family has this myth going that they're all creative geniuses and that the mental health and substance use issues just go hand in hand with that creative genius. And to be fair, many people in my family are genuinely highly creative, but they would narcissistically argue that the creativity somehow justified the damage of the substance use and the other abusive behaviors driven by mental illness or personality disorders. So step one for me was to stop believing the myths that had propped up the family dysfunction. They may be creative people, but they're mentally and emotionally sick and need mental health and substance use support. Number two, sacrificing safety and well-being for convenience or cost savings. This is one of the things that kept me from being able to leave the gathering when things started heading south. So things like agreeing to stay with family members who are only trying to help me, when in reality that offer came with the added expectation of putting up with the chaos. Or driving down with other family members, which left me without an easy means of leaving and potentially jeopardizing my ride back if I didn't do like everyone else does and scratch the chaos and dysfunction up for the course. Number three, leaving myself with no other options. Now, part of this goes part and parcel with numbers 1 and 2, but there were other emotional and psychological ways in which I was left with no other options. So there was another part of the family mythology that had me believing that I was nothing without my family. And so the thought of not being part of these significant family gatherings just left me feeling small and alone, like I was totally unworthy of love, when in fact the total opposite was true. So unpacking this required me to get effective support and to stop isolating myself in the face of the family addiction. I still had to grieve the love that was not currently available to me and my family, but effective support did allow me to create a family of my own choosing. And that gave me viable options during the holidays, not just people who were willing to take in a stray or a holiday orphan during the holidays, but people who were chosen family who truly wanted my company at that time. So that was how I started to change my experience of the holidays. Now, I would love to know about you. So if you're in the US, was your Thanksgiving a total shit show? And is part of you dreading the remaining holidays? For better or for worse, Thanksgiving is already under our belts. And so I invite you, if you feel comfortable, to consider how you could support yourself in doing something a little differently around the upcoming holidays. For example, if my experience resonated with you, you might consider doing some reflection or journaling on the following 3 questions. 1, what family myths keep you sucked into the family dysfunction and thus keep you doing the same thing and hoping for something different? What keeps you believing those myths? 2, are you sacrificing safety and well-being for convenience or cost savings? And if so, how? And can you brainstorm other options? And 3, have you created your own mythology around your self-worth or your worthiness that is somehow tied to tolerating the chaos in the family? Now, before you answer these questions, I highly recommend you have a trusted, supportive, and non-judgmental person who is not a family member with whom you can share what comes up when you answer these questions. Now, it's not that you have to share any of it, but I say this because what comes up might feel really heavy, and you may need someone that can help you process that. This can be a friend, it can be a clergy person, a support group, or even a therapist. But I don't recommend sharing what comes up with family members unless you are absolutely sure that what you share won't be used against you. So that right there is a start. But there are a few other things you can do as well. The first is acknowledge your feelings. If your Thanksgiving was indeed a shit show, then it will be important to acknowledge whatever feelings you feel about that, whether that's anger, disappointment, sadness, frustration, all of the above, or something else. For better or for worse, all healing is on the other side of feeling those feelings, which sucks, I know. But I want to introduce a catch here because there may actually be a step that you need to take before this one if your family is anything like mine. And that is to believe that you actually have a right to these feelings, as in they're valid and there's nothing wrong with you for having them. I didn't have a right to my feelings growing up. And when I got upset or objected to anything, I was told I was too sensitive and I just needed to get over it. It was no big deal. And I was now creating problems for making a big deal of it. And if I didn't get over it, I was told I just needed to leave it in the past. Coming to believe you have a right to these feelings, again, requires effective support. And if that resonates with you, I did put a link in the blog to an Instagram reel I have on what constitutes effective support. And there are links on my resources page to where you might find that. But if you feel like you don't have a right to these feelings, that could be one of the things that keeps you brushing them under the rug year after year. And like I did for so long, continuing to do the same thing over and over every time the holidays came around and hoping for a different result. And you know, sometimes the holidays would go relatively well. And that would happen just often enough to keep me hoping that real change might be just around the corner. But it never, ever stuck. Now, there's another thing that you can do, but before I mention that, I think a little context would be helpful before I talk about it. So I often do a little chat GPT work before I write blog posts. It's a great tool for identifying what the dominant narrative is on the interwebs about any given issue. But when it comes to addiction and family addiction, what comes up on ChatGPT often makes me want to hurl. Now, to be fair to ChatGPT, the previous point did come up. But what ChatGPT had to say about acknowledging your feelings was completely devoid of how difficult that can be and what actually gets in the way for families. And the next point was to initiate open and honest communication. Theoretically, a great idea. In practice, it's much more complicated. In fact, I'm quite confident that you already tried to communicate your concerns, but they have not been heard. And sure, there may be ways in which it would be helpful to shift your approach, but if what you say is not backed up with boundaries, the communication with a loved one using substances often gets nowhere, and your words end up twisted, taken out of context, and used against you. So before I talk about communication, I think it's important to talk about boundaries. Because when most of the literature talks about communication, they're focusing on communicating your concerns with words. Depending on the severity of the substance use or other dysfunction in your family, words about your concerns often get nowhere. When it comes to unacceptable behavior driven by substance use or other dysfunction, boundaries are actually the most effective source of communication there is. But they're incredibly difficult to set and even harder to stick to because you pretty much have to count on backlash. And this is actually why I'm developing an entire workshop on setting boundaries with a loved one's substance use. Boundaries are one of the best forms of communication out there when it comes to family addiction, but it's damn near impossible to do if you don't have effective support. Now, speaking of boundaries, one of the most important boundaries you can set around the holidays is to have a plan B. When you leave yourself with no other options, you end up stuck on the ride with the family dysfunction. And for years, I had left myself on that horrible roller coaster with no other options, both psychologically with my thinking about being nothing without my family, and also materially with the choices I made during the holidays that left me with no readily available option for stepping away from the chaos. I personally had to approach this in a couple of ways. When it came to changing my thinking, I needed effective support in order to do that. And in my case, I found that both through support groups and professional therapy. Once the family mythology no longer had such a tight grip on me, then I was able to make different choices about if and under what conditions I could participate in family holidays. I would only participate if I had my own transportation and a place to stay that was not with a family member. Sometimes that was a hotel, other times I stayed with friends. But when I could, I would also connect with understanding friends, usually other members of my support group, and ask if they could be my backup holiday gathering in case I had to leave my own family gathering. And when it comes to the holidays, the boundaries for me were the conditions under which I was willing to participate and the plan B. And when it comes to the plan B, it's important to be very clear with yourself about what type of behavior or situation is going to trigger the plan B. I also suggest making a commitment to an understanding friend that you will trigger the plan B if those conditions are met. If you're at all like I was and are conflict averse, it's easy to say things aren't that bad when in fact they are. But the plan B is how you say that the behavior is unacceptable. And one of the beautiful things about a plan B is when you have a plan B in place, you don't even need to get that angry about the chaos and the unacceptable behavior because you know you're not trapped. This allows you to communicate your communication to be far more calm and compassionate because it allows other people who they are going to be while you are still taking care of yourself. Then healthier communication can happen after the drama of the holidays has subsided. But the thing is, as I've said so many times, all of this requires effective support. If you're looking at the myths that keep you stuck, you're going to feel some things. And it's a lot easier to allow yourself to feel those things if you've got a reasonably healthy support system outside of your family. If you've never before set a boundary, if you've never created a plan B for the holidays, if you've never deliberately planned for an easy exit around holiday gatherings, the first time you do that can feel really, really scary. And the reality that all of this is even necessary is going to bring up grief, which again brings you back to feeling your feelings. Again, knowing there are people who have your back will make all of that so much easier to walk through. Finally, as with everything around family addiction, I know all too well that everything I've suggested here is easier said than done. And that's the thing that makes me so crazy with a lot of the advice out there to families. They make it sound like it's so simple. Now, the concepts are simple, but the practice of them is anything but. I know that very well, and I know I'm suggesting things that can be really scary to execute and practice. So I want to close this episode by saying, if you're not ready to execute on all of this or even any of this, that's okay. If you just reflect on how you get wrapped up in some kind of family mythology, or maybe you just take your own car, even though you know you have no intention of leaving, no matter what happens. Maybe you just start to feel feelings that you've never been allowed to feel. Whatever you do, start with what you can and just keep it in the back of your head that in the future you can take it a little further. Family addiction and dysfunction is like a huge cruise ship or a semi-truck. Neither can turn around on a dime. It takes time and often some back and forth. But if your Thanksgiving was a shit show and you're even considering what you could do differently, that is a beautiful first step. So I hope this helped. Thanks for watching.